It's November 27th, 1977, the Sunday after Thanksgiving. Everyone is maybe a little worn out by the holiday and by the dread of the work week to come. So the family gathers around the TV to while away a cozy November evening. Mom and Dad want to watch CBS, which is airing 60 Minutes at 7 p.m. Then All in the Family, weirdly, a very special episode about the Ku Klux Klan, and then a sitcom On Our Own, and then the recent movie 3 Days of the Condor, a classic already, even by the standards of 1977. The kids want to watch ABC, where there's a Hardy Boys Nancy Drew mystery hour, followed by a new episode of The $6 Million Man. They compromise by tuning into NBC, which opens week with a rerun of The Wonderful World of Disney, The Adventures of Bullwhip Griffin, a unremembered, unlamented film of the era. And later in the evening, there will be an animated show based on Gary Trudeau's political newspaper comic, Doonesbury, which will be followed, strangely, by the Miss World beauty pageant broadcasting from London, England. But between those things, the family finds something weird. A brand new Rankin-Bass TV movie adapting J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. You know, the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer people, the Frosty the Snowman people, the TV special people. And what follows, well, it largely depends here in this speculative fiction that I have created for you, because it depends very much on how familiar the various members of this hypothetical family are with J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. Because if you've read it and you know the movement of the plot and you already love these characters, then what follows is a 90-minute kaleidoscope of adventure and music and some really great character design and some really shaky character design and some bold, strong narrative choices. If you are less familiar with The Hobbit, I mean, good luck. You're not going to get the sense, impression, wonder of the Rankin-Bass animated film, but you are probably going to feel a little nauseated by the time that it is over. Welcome to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. Happy Hobbit Day, everyone. Happy Hobbit Day in the chat here to Brian and to Ryan and to Demon Dave and to Elizabeth Stevens. It is so good to have you all with me here tonight. To celebrate the birthdays of Frodo and Bilbo, both, we are here to discuss the first full-length movie adaptation of Tolkien's work, the 77 version of The Hobbit, written by Romeo Muller and directed by Arthur Rankin Jr. and Jules Bass. I'm going to call up here our first slide for the evening. I've just drawn some selected slides just to give you a sense, in case it's been a minute since you've seen this particular movie, which I have watched twice today. I just wanted to pull up some evocative samples from the film. It's interesting to think about where Tolkien was in 77 as a cultural figure, because while The Hobbit is a significant success upon its release, and The Lord of the Rings too, right? Let's not underestimate that by any means, but he has yet to achieve, by the publication of The Return of the King, his enormous cultural status, because that doesn't really come along until the late 1960s. It's not until The Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's work in general becomes a symbol of the countercultural revolution here in the United States that he really assumes his position as the father of modern fantasy. Of course, Tolkien dies in the early 70s, and by September of 77, 2 months before the release of The Hobbit, in fact, Christopher Tolkien releases The Silmarillion. So this is a particularly important, significant time in the graph of Tolkien's popularity, I suppose. This is obviously the first of the three animated, three of the first four animated Tolkien movies. The Rankin-Bass 77 adaptation, as I say, written by Romeo Muller, will be followed by the Bakshi Lord of the Rings adaptation, which will then be followed by another Rankin-Bass movie, The Return of the King, trying to wrap up the story in a fairly ineffective way. And look, cards on the table. Let me come back to my camera just to earnestly speak to you all here directly at home. Here on Hobbit Day, I just really want to talk about my personal response to this film, because I have been dismissive. I know I've listened to the old podcast that I did, and I've looked at the scripts that I wrote for those, and I was dismissive of this thing. And I'm not going to say that it is massively successful. I'm not going to say that it is even particularly accessible. I'm not going to say that all of the character design works, and certainly not that all of the animation works, though for a budget of $3 million, even in 1977, it does occasionally look really good, and only very occasionally really bad. What I'm struck by, really thinking about this film, really watching this film, is how passionate it feels. It is such a committed recreation, oftentimes with little interpretation, oftentimes with too little thought, but a great deal of commitment. It is apparently the product of a sincere desire to replicate The Hobbit on your TV screen on NBC on the Sunday after Thanksgiving in 1977. I'm really struck by how thoughtful it is in some ways, right? It's only in really the movement of the story. The excisions, I think, are smart. The pacing, I think, is crazy, right? If you don't know The Hobbit, it's a wild series of choices, but they are a series of choices that comes from the cutthroat world of TV production. There was, a 72-minute or whatever it is slot that had to be filled. It was a 90-minute slot going out on NBC, so minus commercial time. That gives you fixed down to the second how much time you have to play with. And I think it's just astonishing. I think it's so interesting, so confident in its assertions about what Tolkien intends in his fictional world and how we are to understand it. I can see as Demon Dave was pointing out, 72 minutes versus 10 hours. It is impossible to discuss this film without referencing the Peter Jackson trilogy. I will say, obviously, I'm on the record here, I think the Peter Jackson trilogy has a lot of problems. I don't think that movie trilogy works at all well, and I think that it falls apart the further into the trilogy you get. But I do kind of want to put a flag in the ground and say the problem with the Jackson trilogy is not necessarily its length. I think you could make 10 hours of really gripping and engaging Hobbit story. I think, for me, it's the excess. It's the fact, not that it is 10 hours, but that it is padded within that 10 hours. And then there are other things that we just elide. There are other things that we just leap right over. We don't spend the necessary time. So I mean, we're going to have the opportunity to talk more carefully, more fully about the Peter Jackson trilogy at some point. But yeah, I mean, it is kind of inescapable, right? You could do, 6, 7 versions of this. You could show this movie 7 times within the running time of the extended cut of the Jackson trilogy. It's just a lot to navigate here. And here, it is so condensed. It is so focused. It is so drawn down, excessively so, right? We're going to talk in just a moment about the actual start of the movie, and we can really track how that moves. But I do want to catch up with the chat here. Brian calls out here, I have 2 observations about the opening credit sequence. It states that this is based on the original version of The Hobbit, but I am inclined to disagree. Yes, this is one of the most interesting things about this production. I don't understand the legal mechanism that allows this thing to exist. And furthermore, I don't know of anyone who understands the legal mechanism that allows this thing to exist. By 1977, even by 1975, the first time that this project really begins to move at Rankin Bass, the movie rights for all of Tolkien's works are all sewn up. He sells them in 1969 to UA, to United Artists, which eventually sells them on to Saul's Ants. By the time that we get to Rankin Bass producing this film, there is no way that they have the rights. Now, there seems to be, judging from that opening plate, right, based on the original version of The Hobbit, which seems to imply that they're drawing something, or that they're drawing exclusively from the first edition, which, as Brian alludes here, they're not. This is not a first edition Hobbit that we're getting, particularly when we get to Gollum. There seems to be some idea, and certainly representatives of Rankin Bass after the fact, including, I believe, Arthur Rankin Jr., have said that there was a copyright loophole that allowed them to make this film, which I just don't know if that's true. I think that there were copyright issues around the publication of The Lord of the Rings in the United States in the early 1950s because Houghton Mifflin didn't properly follow copyright procedure. So there was a very short period of time when The Lord of the Rings was basically public domain. And that was patched by a subsequent edition that was properly filed for copyright. But to the best of my understanding and the best of my research that I did this afternoon, there was never a period, and has yet to be a period, when The Hobbit, first edition or second edition, is in the public domain here in the United States. So I'm somewhat baffled by it. I don't really know what the gambit is, and no one is talking about it. No one has ever talked about it. There's no representative of what was previously Tolkien Enterprises and is now Middle-earth Enterprises, the Saul's Ants company. No one there has ever said, oh yeah, that thing, we sued them into oblivion. Or alternatively, we came to a reckoning and we came to an understanding, and a large envelope of money was traded beneath the table in a Italian restaurant somewhere in New York City. I have no explanation as to how this thing exists. I have no explanation as to the legal right, and certainly not, this odd introductory gambit on the part of the film to kind of situate itself in a legal loophole that, as far as I can tell, does not exist. Brian continues, where did all the horses go? The dwarves and Gandalf were all mounted on horses during the opening credit sequence, and Gandalf even pulls Bilbo onto his horse. But in the following scene, after where the commercial break would be inserted, they're all walking and have with 2 ponies which are carrying their supplies. I have nothing. I got nothing on that one, I'm afraid. I don't know. It's tricky to understand in some cases exactly which creative choices were made and where the excisions were made. It does feel We'll maybe talk about this a little later, but there are specific points in the film where it feels as though scenes were lost. It feels as though scenes were cut. It feels as though maybe it was... I can't imagine that it would have been originally promised a 2-hour slot, right? I can't imagine that we would have been given, what would that have been, 22 extra minutes? No, 24 extra minutes of movie. It doesn't feel as though the pacing there works either, but it does feel as though there have been some cuts made for sure. No cuts to Glenn Yarborough singing The Greatest Adventure, though, sadly. We'll talk about the music in just a minute, I'm sure. Let me catch up with the chat. Brian saying this may be childhood nostalgia, but I really love the songs. Or maybe different scenes were animated by different teams. It is interesting that in keeping with the Rankin Bass production cycle at the time, all of this was sent out to Japan for primary animation. Topcraft, in fact, is the company that in the early 1980s, after it has been working with Rankin Bass, Topcraft effectively implodes, and from the ashes rise Studio Ghibli, which I think is a really great trade. Honestly, that's a pretty fantastic payoff for this production company. And it's wild how much early 80s anime you can see in this film, and also particularly I'm thinking of the character designs of Gollum, I'm thinking of the character designs of the trolls, some of the location work, which is all just so beautiful. Those painted backdrops, I think, just look phenomenal throughout. I have nothing bad to say about any one of the painted backdrops. Some of the character animation, well, even then, I don't think the character animation is bad per se. I think the character animation is an odd fit with the character concept art. I think that the dwarves in particular are too fussy in their design to be comfortably animated at this kind of price point. For this kind of budget, we don't get a lot of mobility in the faces because they're all so like defined and craggy and strange looking. The characters that feel more organic to this film, like Gollum, I think are very well animated indeed, and really, really loves it. Ryan saying, nostalgia, no way, the song slaps. Certified bops end to end. Ryan, we may not be in complete agreement there, but we'll certainly pull out some favorites as we move through this evening. Let me get back to, I'll show you a slide here just so we can keep going. In fact, let's take this slide here from the beginning of the book, because this is a wildly efficient beginning. I'm not sure that it completely works, and I'm not sure that it completely honors what Tolkien is going for, right? I'm not sure that it echoes the comfortable, prosaic, almost circuitous introduction that we get at the beginning of The Hobbit. Tolkien takes a long time, if you recall, before we get to The Hobbit, before we get to Bilbo. In A Hole in the Ground there lived a hobbit, and then we spend like 3 pages on the hole. We spend a lot of time talking about Bag End, and then we talk about hobbits in aggregate. We talk about hobbits as a people before we get to Bilbo, and there's a pleasure to that. There's a very careful piece of pacing there, evident in the text, that allows us to sink comfortably into the world and allows the juvenile audience to sink comfortably into that world. Here we take a completely different approach, which is a very brief voiceover introduction, an active narrator in this part of the film, and then we are into it, right? Bilbo comes outside with his gigantic pipe, he puffs his smoke ring, and then we get, oh, I believe I have a slide of this. Let me, is my next slide Bilbo? Oh, my next slide is Bilbo. I mean, on the one level, it's a really good bit of character design, right? It's really kind of charming. It's not what I imagined, but it is pretty strong nonetheless. But I wanted to talk less about Bilbo and talk more about Gandalf. A broadly successful, if somewhat incompatible, bit of characterization we get from Gandalf throughout this piece. And I've been thinking about it a lot in terms of the positioning of the narrative voice vis-a-vis Gandalf, because the narrative goes to such lengths early in The Hobbit and then again early in The Lord of the Rings to make us comfortable with Gandalf, to kind of bring him down into the Hobbit realm of the Shire, to normalize and almost naturalize Gandalf. We never get the opportunity to be wowed by him. The closest we get to being genuinely wowed by Gandalf, I would say, is the aftermath of his fall in Moria, when we find him again in the fringes of the forest, and he is Gandalf the White. That's the closest I think we get to a real unveiling of his power, or at least, that is the closest that we get to Gandalf being as disproportionate to the tone of the text as he really genuinely is, this pseudo-angelic force in the world, right? Obviously, the closest that we get, I think, to seeing the full manifestation of his power is him facing down the Witch King of Angmar at the gates of Minas Tirith. But, you know, everything there is of such a high order. The tone is already so high there that he kind of fits it. He matches it better. But it's interesting that we get this tension here, this tickle here. Demon Dave is saying it seems odd that Gandalf or John Huston is narrating. It's like he's the main character, but later I think there are moments that Bilbo takes back the main focus. Bilbo absolutely does. When Gandalf specifically hands him his journal and says, oh, by the way, at this point, start keeping notes. Just start filling this out. A really odd bit of reframing, right? The giving of the map and the key in the Troll Cave, I think, is really interesting and implies something very curious about Gandalf's relationship with Thorin in that moment. It is almost as though the company en masse have passed a test. It is almost as though we have overcome our first hurdle, and now Thorin has proved himself worthy of the map and the key, which, I mean, yes, not true to the book, but fascinating nonetheless. There is something genuinely interesting there. Gandalf throughout, I think, works very, very broadly. I do think the voice performance is good. I do think that he's generally very imposing. I like how unsettling he can be. I like, actually, one of the benefits of the frantic pace of this piece, particularly through the first act, is that Gandalf disappearing and reappearing works really well. It feels more like a magic trick than it does in the book, where it's just, oh, well, I guess he's gone and has been gone for us. Oh, no, he's back. That's great. Awesome. You know, he's really coming in and out of the story as though he does not really belong to it, or as though it does not really belong to him, in a way that I find very interesting. I do think that is some strong intentional adaptational work there. How do we think, what do we think, I guess, of the voice cast in general? Do we, are we generally positive? I think I'm very strong on, John Huston. As I say, I'm looking at the list here because I haven't completely, internalized. It is telling that, Jack Dillion, voices the vast majority of the dwarves, who arguably do get more characterization on screen in this film than they do in the pages of the book, because you can see them, right? They're just like right there. Fili and Kili, just as hot as they are in the Peter Jackson adaptation. There was a lot of uproar then about hot dwarves. Can we really reconcile ourselves to hot dwarves? And turns out hot dwarves were here the whole time. The one that doesn't work for me, and I am aware that this is a controversial position, I don't think that Orson Bean and his mellow, wry, transatlantic thing really works for Bilbo. And of course, it's the 70s, so we're recording all of these things very, very separately. We're recording these things oftentimes on very different equipment. He sounds like he is just closer to the mic, that he is just warmer on the mic than basically everyone else in the film, which always kind of jangles my ear just a little bit, but I'm not sure that he completely works for me. I do think that Huston is great. As I say, I think that Brother Theodore, a comedian, oftentimes credited in this film, in fact, as just Theodore, a comedian, a monologuist, a soliloquist, a very gifted, public speaker and holder of the audience's attention. I think that he is fantastic as Gollum. I think that he works so beautifully in a way that is very compatible, obviously, with what we will get later from Andy Serkis, but also more urgent, less pitiable, less complex, right? Because he is giving us a performance that fits The Hobbit, and here we are at Riddles in the Dark, that fits the second edition of The Hobbit, right? This is absolutely, resolutely not a first edition book, and I am interested in the changes that we make. Obviously, we excise some of the riddles. I think that is inevitable. It was astonishing that Jackson, in his commitment to the realization of the book on the screen, took all of the riddles and presented them fully and did not, mess with them more substantially. I think that's an extremely bold choice and betrays a huge confidence in his own filmmaking. I think that it really works. So here we cut them down, and I understand why, and it generally works. We also get in that sequence something that I'm rather fond of throughout the film, which is the repositioning of the music as non-diegetic, right? We're getting songs just leaching into the soundtrack. We get one of the riddles sung over the end of the sequence, or the latter, third of the sequence between Bilbo and Gollum. I'm particularly fond of the maybe not the rendition that we get of the Tra-la-la-lolly Down in the Valley song from the elves as we arrive at Rivendell, but I do really like making that a piece of the soundtrack rather than enfolding it into, the action that we see. And we give, Bilbo the line about elven songs not being something to miss. I think it really works. Let me see. So Ryan's saying, sorry. So here I am. I'm picking up some tension here. Yes, Demon Dave says, not sure about the accent of the Elven King. I think it's the guy who played Mr. Freeze in the campy Batman days. It is. It's Otto Preminger, who played Mr. Freeze in a couple episodes of the 66 Batman series. A noted director and producer, of course, Otto Preminger. The elves of Mirkwood are bewildering. I don't know how we got there. I don't know why those choices were made. By contrast, love what we do with Elrond, except for the beard. The beard is an odd bit of character design, but apart from that, I really like the depiction of Elrond. I like the performance. If you have to simplify all of Rivendell down to this single A-frame out there in the middle of the woods, then okay, you can do that. But I like the halo around his head, this kind of proof of his his elven superiority, I suppose. All of that works. I also am very fond of, this is, not something that I can really credit the filmmakers with as much as I can credit to an oversight on the animation team. I do really like that they got the Moonlighters wrong. I'm just very fond of the fact, like it just warms my heart that they got the wrong set of runes on the map to be the Moonlighters. So we're getting the completely prosaic message that is there the whole time is secretly revealed when we get to Rivendell. And the actual, the runes in the middle of the map are not revealed, but it's pretty good. Chris Stevens is saying that John Huston is very good. Orson Bean, not so much. Yeah, I kind of feel the same way. Brian's saying Smaug is fantastic. Smaug is undeniably fantastic. But Ryan says that he loves Bean as Bilbo so much. That's really great. And Elizabeth saying that she digs the 70s folksy vibrato. Look, I'm very fond of a lot of the music in this. The music is all by Jules Bass, who writes the lyrics, who wrote the lyrics for all of the Rankin Bass stuff, right? He is just there. I say he writes the lyrics. He writes the lyrics for this one song because all of the other lyrics, of course, are taken from Tolkien. He works with Maury Laws on all of the music. Again, just a complete constant in the Rankin Bass production. The problem for me is Glenn Yarborough. I'm fond of American folk. I'm even, not terribly against American folk of the late 1970s. I think there's some lovely stuff there. I think that he sucks, and I think that this song is bad, but at least we get to hear it 25 times. I think it is hands down my least favorite thing about the entire movie. Whereas I think that the arrangements of what we get of the actual Hobbit songs are generally very good. I really like how they're used. As I say, particularly when we're pulling them out and we're using them as part of the soundscape, using them as part of the soundtrack of the film and not dropping them in diegetically. As I say, the Tra-la-la-lolly I think is really good. The use of Misty Mountain's Cold right when the dwarves are introduced, when it turns out that all 13 of the dwarves are just standing behind bushes right outside of Bag End, which is an odd conceit, but gets us where we need to be very quickly at least. The way that piece of music comes in, I think is really strong. And, I think that... I'm still on the fence about the Goblin song, honestly. I get it. I do see why it is popular. I do see why it is the thing from this film that still has mimetic power in the Tolkien fandom, I think, today. I don't think there's much here that is often referenced or that is often cited. I don't think there's a lot going on here that is really common parlance, right, in Tolkien circles. But I do think that the Goblin song, the Down to Goblin song, Down to Goblin Town song, does hold a certain place in the heart of the fandom, which I really like. I also really like the 15 Birds and 5 Fir Trees. I think that works too. They are a little discontinuous, perhaps, with the soundtrack as a whole. I think the songs in general do create a little bit of tension with the rest of the orchestral score, but it works kind of pretty well, all told. I bounced out of the chat here. I need to come back and catch up because so many here tonight. Yeah, Ryan says the Elves of Mirkwood is my least favorite thing about this. Weird Germanic monsters is an odd choice. I mean, there's a part of it, right, that does make sense. We want to land... we have 4 minutes to do all of Mirkwood, so we want to land the elves immediately as a threat. We want to distinguish them from Elrond. Tolkien distinguishes them from Elrond. Making them this monstrous, I think, is an odd choice. And yeah, I can't quite get through it. Anyway, we were talking about the riddle game. I want to circle back to that and talk a little bit more about particularly how we close it out. I think that in general, it works. The visual representation of Bilbo's invisibility is kind of good. I really like the way that we use the lighting as he's drawing Sting and then putting Sting away and then drawing Sting. And we see like the changing light in the scene really works for me. My problem with it is how we close that out and Bilbo kind of very casually eluding Gollum. We're not landing that moment because, of course, it is a moment that is incredibly important. If we're doing second edition Gollum, which, to be fair, we're not completely doing second edition Gollum. There are like some hybridizations going on here. But I do think that if we're going to do second edition Gollum, and we're obviously crafting this film for an audience that is familiar with The Lord of the Rings, because no one in 1977 knows of The Hobbit and does not know of The Lord of the Rings, right? Just the cultural osmosis has occurred. These things are unified. The Hobbit is now, despite what Tolkien may have wanted early in his career, The Hobbit is presented as a prequel, or at least a prelude to The Lord of the Rings. And I don't like his very casual dismissal of Gollum there and the running out. Although I do love Brother Theodore's take on Baggins. We hates it forever. He is unhinged in that moment. It has the quality of a vocal performance that is leaving absolutely nothing in reserve, absolutely nothing on the table. And if there is a criticism of Andy Serkis as a vocal performer, I think that it is that he has never... let me parse this properly. He always feels as though he is in control of his instrument as a performer, even when the character is not completely in control of their being, of their essential selves. Chris is saying that he agrees about J.R.R., about Glenn J.R.R. You agree with me, or you agree with Elizabeth here in the chat, who is still defending not just J.R.R. but also John Denver, which is... yeah, another one that's a little hard to get behind there. Let me share another slide here just to mix up the visual representation this evening. Here we have the dwarves introducing themselves. It is a wild, disparate group here, which, again, I do kind of like as we're introducing them. Let's skip through some of these slides so I can see what else there was to talk. Yes, so Elrond and Rivendell, very effective, I think very strong. I think that the positioning of Elrond here works quite well. And for some reason, I need to think about this a little more and really figure out why it is that the handling of the swords in particular here is for me almost more effective than it is in the original book. There's something here about Elrond as a figure of authority, the way that he is presented here as a figure of authority exceeding even Gandalf, that makes me feel okay about him giving away these, ancient relics of Gondolin that was. I think that there's something there that works rather beautifully. From there, we move into, I guess, we'll get straight to the goblins. And if I have criticism of, here's the slide of the Moonlatchers being revealed as well, which is really great. I do love the use of Tolkien's original art in the film. It sits very well. It sits very comfortably. It has been very lovingly replicated here. And again, we can see I feel, it's strange to be discussing this film relatively on the heels of the War of the Rohirrim, because I do have feelings about this film that are very similar to my feelings about War of the Rohirrim, including almost every still looks great, right? Every frame, a painting here in this film. It's only in the animation that it kind of falls apart. I was really struck by the similarity of the animation of the eagles after we get out of the frying pan and into the fire. The animation of the eagles, they're very similar to the animation of the eagles at the beginning, in particular, of War of the Rohirrim. Demon Dave says, I like the tease that the world is richer. Elrond's description here in some other parts of the movie. Yeah, exactly, right? We're for all that we have this breakneck pace through the events of The Hobbit, we still have these moments of what Tolkien called the illusion of depth. We still have this idea that the world extends beyond the bounds of the frame, that the world extends beyond this one small, narrow adventure, which really works in terms of situating Bilbo within the span of the adventure. One of the things that I think we lose a little bit in the second edition, very slightly in the second edition, and then really kind of lose in the Peter Jackson adaptation, is the idea that this is a side story, right? It has important consequences. It matters not just to the dwarves, but to the political stability of the whole area, right? It is, in a sense, the first domino to fall in the War of the Ring. And not just Bilbo finding the ring, but destabilizing the power centers of evil east of the Misty Mountains, right? Smaug is taken out, Dol Guldur is taken out effectively, and we rebalance the political structure in that part of the world, which does lead us into the War of the Ring. But Bilbo isn't a part of that story, right? He's not. It's only glimpsed in the Battle of Five Armies, and it is to the book's credit and to Bilbo's credit that he is so distant from those events. Let's move on here then and get to, I guess I skipped over the goblins. I didn't pull a slide of the goblins. The goblins really work. And I think that there is an argument that dehumanizing them, making them more bestial, more monstrous, gets us past some of the moral questions that inevitably rise when we're talking about the goblins, when we're talking about the orcs. Is it really okay to kill these thinking, talking, sapient creatures that not only think and talk, but sing, that have culture, that have like civilization here beneath the Misty Mountains? Is that okay? And the less human they are, the less we have to engage with that question directly. Of course, that is directly contrary to what Tolkien intended, right? They are supposed to be much closer to recognizable figures, but I think it works. It's pretty solid. And again, yeah, the music just it is kind of undeniable. I don't know. There needs to be a category for things which are like undeniably good, but also I don't like them, right? I need to like be more confident and comfortable kind of expressing those two seemingly contrary positions. Though, in general, I have no problem expressing that as a contrary position. I have no problem sharing the idea that there are lots of things I like. There are lots of things that are very good that I am insufficiently capable of liking, and it's possible that those songs are one of them. The flash of light here is just really strong on this image of the ring, and I do love one of my favorite animation techniques throughout this film is, because everything is painted, it is animated on cells. This is like very traditional animation style. All the backdrops are painted. All the foreground is animated on transparent cells that are then filmed with actual cameras. So we can zoom in to these things, and every time you zoom into them, they kind of look like garbage, right? One example right at the beginning of the film is Bilbo with his back turned right there in his kitchen, and the camera zooms in on the piece, and all of the lines just blow out. All the line weights are wrong. All the detail starts to get fuzzy. The textures all kind of lose their cohesion just a little bit as we're coming in. But then we cut into a closer shot of Bilbo, and he looks great. It is just this fantastic way of the film generating its own textural approach and kind of giving us this glimpse of a really bad looking version of the shot before we hit the cut, and then get a really good looking version of the shot. And this is a prime example. I think this posted insert here of Bilbo holding the ring with the flash of light, with the inscriptions on the outside of the ring. Let me call that slide back up because this is controversial too. I really love this design of the ring, even though, borderline non-canonical, and certainly I don't think that you could do a different design. And I might be, just revealing myself to be a fool here. Maybe we've already done this in the Rings of Power in season 2 and I haven't seen it, but I don't think that you can do a design for the One Ring that isn't the One Ring from the Jackson movies now. I think it has become iconic, right? Not just in that Scott McCloud understanding comics kind of way, right? Which honestly, this movie could do with being a little more iconic in that Scott McCloud way, on that sliding scale of realism in terms of sequential art, in terms of comic book art, that the iconic thing is simple and dynamic and expressive, and the realist thing or the naturalist thing actually looks like that object that you, or that character, that person that you are depicting. And I do think that the dwarves in particular would benefit from being a little more iconic and a little less naturalistic so that we could get some more expressive animation. And I'm really bothered by the close-ups that we get on the dwarves where their mouth is just like a patch of that oddly fleshy pink that moves, and oftentimes out of focus slightly, with their mouths and beards. Let's keep pushing on because I want to talk about, what is the next slide that I pulled here? I should have written this down. Gollum, of course. This design is fantastic. I remember when we were talking about gosh, I think it was when we were talking about Riddles in the Dark in the text sessions here on Shire Reckoning. So just a few weeks ago, we were talking about Riddles in the Dark, and I had the slide of all the different golems from the different parts of the world, and lo and behold, there is a Japanese golem that looks very frog-like. That's kind of not quite like this, but wow, it's interesting to see the similarity. I think this is a great design, right? Again, much like the goblins, much like the elves of Mirkwood, it is breaking Tolkien's intent. He does not look the way that he is supposed to look. The goblins don't look the way that they are supposed to look. But if we're setting that aside, I think he works brilliantly. I think he's very much a product of his environment. He's incredibly expressive because he is so simplified, because he is much more iconic, much more freely rendered than some of the other characters. I think he really works. Demon Dave is saying, being 9 years old, this is the version of Gollum that I see in my head when I read the books. Creeped me out as much as the close-up of the Wicked Witch of the Crystal Ball and Wizard of Oz. That is a great pull. Yeah, I like that a lot. And Elizabeth saying, I'm glad you like the Gollum design. Pretty fantastic, I think. Yeah, no, I really like it. It's very strong and in movement just as compelling when he's slipping and moving so slowly. We're getting the evocation of the book, right? That he can move on his little boat through the waters of the lake without making a sound. And we evoke that in the animation, and it just pops brilliantly. So as I say, not thrilled about the end of the sequence and the absence of pity, right? I don't like Bilbo getting the ring and then being a jerk, being a bully here. That doesn't really work for me, but within the span of this story, it doesn't really matter. We have to move on just a little bit to get to the two big excisions, I think. Here we are. Post Out of the Frying Pan into the Fire, post 15 Birds and 5 Fir Trees, we're getting the flight of the eagles, who conveniently just carry them all the way to Mirkwood. For all the fans of the Jackson trilogy who demanded to know why can't the eagles just fly them all the way there to Mount Doom, well, here we fly the hobbits and the dwarves and company. Brian says that looks painful, and indeed it does. Very true to the book, though, which I like a great deal. We just fly them all the way to Mirkwood, and we cut Beorn entirely. Do we need Beorn? Does Beorn contribute anything to the plot? No. Beorn gives us two things. One, thematic, in terms of our exploration of the West and the Wild, as we discussed recently in our discussion of Queer Lodgings, that chapter. But the other thing that he gives us is a little bit of perspective on what is happening. One of the most interesting things that we get from Beorn, I guess three things. He also gives us this fine comic interlude. He also gets us this inversion of what happened back at Bag End. But since that didn't happen, since we don't have the casual drip by drip introduction of the dwarves in Bag End, we don't really need to replicate that with Beorn either. The other thing that Beorn gives us is insight into the state of the world. He's the one that tells us that the forest road that was the original plan has now been beset by goblins, and that our circuitous route down through Goblin Town and out the other side has, in fact, as is so often the case, turned out to be very fortunate indeed. So we get all the way to Mirkwood, and it's at Mirkwood. Well, I guess we've already addressed this a little bit in Goblin Town, but it really does strike me when we get to Mirkwood, and we start accelerating the violence of the film, or rather, not accelerating the violence of the film, because there are interesting choices made in this adaptation that I think partly stem from the idea that this is Rankin Bass, right? As I say, famous for Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, famous for Frosty the Snowman. They are very open to juvenile audiences. They make children's films. This is not entirely a children's film. It is a little tonally richer, tonally darker, certainly more narratively ambitious than those other stories, but it's still kind of falling into the same framework. And it is going out on NBC. It is going out at 8 p.m. on a Sunday evening. But the other thing that is different, the other thing that has changed between the publication of The Hobbit and 1977, 50-year gap here, basically, we are looking at an America that is culturally post-Vietnam. We're looking at an America that is feeling very differently about violence and bloodshed, and our willingness to engage in violence and bloodshed, right? The whole turn at the end of this film, I'm kind of folding these two ideas together, but the removal of the Arkenstone from its pivotal point in the plot, and its replacement by a kind of general fatigue of war, right? As Bilbo says, Thorin is right, I just don't understand war. And instead of, valiantly being struck and going down during the Battle of Five Armies, he just lays down and puts on his ring and kind of, blocks it all out, because we are in, I think, a society, a cultural milieu, a cultural moment that is very defined by being anti-war, that is defined by being resistant to notions of, in particular, grandeur and heroism, right? The idea of a good war does not have a lot of cultural purchase in the United States in 1977. And I think that that's one of the reasons that we relocate the Arkenstone story and make it more personal, right? On the one hand, just in terms of the time frame that we have to deal with, it really works because we don't have to introduce another element. Instead, we get to leverage Thorin's envy of Bilbo, right? It is Bilbo's popularity almost that triggers this event, coupled with Bilbo's refusal to accept the necessity of this war, to accept the idea of a good and virtuous war. I think it's a really interesting bit of repositioning. And again, Beorn kind of falls out of that, and then really the structure of the last act of the story kind of falls out of that too. Let me see. Beorn is to The Hobbit as Tom Bombadil is to The Lord of the Rings in visual media, i.e. not there, says Brian. Brian, did you say earlier that you hadn't seen the Jackson trilogy? Because I promise Beorn is in the Jackson trilogy and maybe doesn't need to be, but it's tough. No, it was Hugh. Sorry, Hugh, I didn't see you pop into the chat earlier. Hugh says, never saw the Hobbit movies. I have pictures in my brain since I was very young with the critical response to those movies. I'm worried the movie will ruin those images. That's a really interesting question. Would it ruin the movies? Would it ruin the ideas that you have in your head of the books? I don't think so. I think that, particularly if you're a fan of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, Jackson's adaptations there, so much of it is compatible that I think it's generally enriching, and what is bad is just so stupid that I don't think it'll touch you. I don't think that anything gets ruined by those movies. I'm hesitating as I say this. You know what? Diane gets kind of ruined for me. The showing up of the dwarves at the Battle of Five Armies is a tough moment for me because of that film now. But, maybe I'll feel differently when we get back to it. Yeah. Brian's saying no, it wasn't. Good. Okay. I'm trying to keep everybody straight. It's okay. Demon Dave is saying, good point about the war. Yeah, it was the 70s. Yeah, it was okay to kill goblins and spiders, even though they speak. Exactly. I like that Bilbo talks about greed, even though the Arkenstone is not part of it. You're right. We're still honoring some of that emotional trajectory there, where we don't lean so much on the idea of dragon sickness, which is such a powerful idea and would be such an interesting, again, right, just to bag on the Jackson adaptations, I guess. It is so frustrating that in the 2010s, at a period in our collective history where greed is of perhaps more direct and consequential relevance than ever, Jackson decides to use dragon sickness as a metaphor for Thorin's own obsession and his narcissism and his arrogance, rather than really linking it to, the idea that hordes beget dragons as much as the other way around. I think there's some fascinating, we're going to be talking about this in a few weeks. I don't want to necessarily shoot my bolts too early vis-a-vis the conversations on dragon sickness before we get to Erebor here in our discussion of The Hobbit. But yeah, it's a little tough. With the exception, Elizabeth saying that she really hates the Jackson Hobbit movies, with the exception of Richard Armitage and Luke Evans. Richard Armitage, I think, is fantastic. Luke Evans, I think, is fantastic. I'm gonna stand up for Martin Freeman. I think that Martin Freeman basically doesn't put a foot wrong in those films. I think he's really quite good. And I think he's weird casting, but if you start from the position of we absolutely have to have Benedict Cumberbatch in this film or in these films, I think he's pretty good. I think that Thranduil is extremely badly represented in those films, but that Lee Pace is great. I think there's, there are some things to like, even as that he's always just himself, Martin Freeman, that is, says Elizabeth. I mean, yes, I do think that is maybe fair. I do think that he's not, what is the word? An actor? So much as he is a person who is in things. More of a celebrity than an actor, I guess. We should push on here because I am already kind of running out the clock. I need to share this slide just to indicate for those of you who perhaps don't have the freshest recollection of Thranduil, our elven king here. And yeah, I talked in the podcast today about the difference between the Calaquendi and the Moraquendi, right? The difference between the elves who have seen the light of Valinor and those who have not. And boy, howdy, I mean, this is a bad luck. This is, but at the same time, okay, I am being, somewhat snide about this. I do love like the acting that is happening here in our rendition of this character. I think that this posture is crazy, but also brilliant. I think, had Lee Pace been adopting this posture, I think it would have completely worked for that version of the character. I like very much to, again, look at these backdrops are just phenomenal, but the rendering of the woodland realm has a quality of precision. I need to go and look actually, at exactly what the budgets were like in 1977 for animation, because $3 million does not sound like a lot of money. Even in 1977, animation is famously extremely expensive as an art form. It is painstaking and was even more so before the advent of, the digital revolution. But I would be really interested to see, what was Disney spending? I know this is absolutely the nadir of Disney at this point, but I'd be fascinated to see what they were spending around this time. I'd be fascinated to see what, Bakshi was spending on the rotoscoped Lord of the Rings movie that comes out 1 year later, which I think, in terms of its art direction, in terms of its graphic design, I think the Bakshi film looks much worse than this film, honestly. And I think that The Return of the King looks worse than this film, too. I do think that this is the best looking of the first three. It would be really interesting, though, to do a direct contrast. Maybe next year for Hobbit Day, we'll look at the Bakshi, and then the following year we'll come back for The Return of the King, which comes out in 1980. It really is that fast. It's 77 for The Hobbit, it's 78 for The Lord of the Rings, the rotoscoped Bakshi, and then it's 1980 for The Return of the King, which does not really work. I mentioned, I think, back when I was talking, my favorite detail of the second Rankin Bass of The Return of the King, which is produced as a semi-sequel just to wrap up the Bakshi more than anything else, because Bakshi himself had a real fight with the studio at the time. I really love that the working title for the sequel to The Lord of the Rings was literally Frodo the Hobbit 2. Which, I mean, we used to be a country, we used to make things. Demon David saying, I assume that's what happened to elves who didn't go into the West. Yes, exactly. Let's wrap up my slides, I think, with one final, which is, of course, Smaug. A really excellent voice performance here by Richard Boone. I think just all of the presence, all of the danger, right? I do love... I'm just realizing now that this is an interesting counterpoint, or could at least potentially be an interesting counterpoint, because while this Smaug looks more like a cat than the Smaug in the Jackson trilogy, the Smaug in the Jackson trilogy acts more like a cat, particularly playing with Bilbo the way that he does. I really like that contrast there. And what Boone gives us is... It's a presence, it's a sense of agency, right? It's a sense of almost protagonism. It's a sense that he is so confident in his position that he doesn't have to play with this burglarious hobbit who has found his way into Erebor. He can just be dominant. And I really love the way that works out. It's a really beautiful piece of adaptation. So I should probably be moving towards a wrap up here. And I guess, to conclude, the thing that I find most interesting about this piece, and the thing which I think is most successful, and the lesson that I think that we can take from it, is a kind of intent. I said before that what differentiates for me the Jackson Lord of the Rings trilogy from the Jackson Hobbit trilogy is that when choices have to be made in the Jackson trilogy, as they inevitably must, these are different media. They have different strengths, they have different weaknesses, they have different possibilities, different capabilities, and different impossibilities from each other, right? So you have to make changes, you have to make choices. The idea of literally transposing the text onto the screen is a naive idea that cannot ever really work, no matter how much we might wish that it were the case. The choices, the adaptive process that Jackson goes through for The Lord of the Rings always to me makes sense. I can identify the question that he was trying to answer by the choice that he made. I don't always agree with the answers. I don't always agree with his strategies. I don't always agree with the inclusions that he chooses for that film, but I can understand what he's getting at. It is when we get to The Hobbit that I no longer understand the questions. I no longer understand what it was that he was trying to achieve by introducing Radagast and his bunny sled. Just for one random example out of the first film, and there are 90 other examples, right? Tauriel is the least of it. Tauriel makes very transparent sense in terms of adaptation, but there's so much in those movies that doesn't. What I find most interesting about the Rankin Bass Hobbit from 1977 is that just like the Lord of the Rings trilogy, I can feel the workings under the surface of a dedicated adapter. I can sense the presence of someone who genuinely loves this original text, someone who is absolutely operating within very tight constraints, and someone who is making ambitious choices, someone who is really making bold choices to tell this story in this medium as fully and as completely and as passionately, as powerfully as possible. Like, we might grumble a little that we don't get all of the riddles in the Dark sequence, but it's amazing that we get as many riddles as we get. It's amazing, frankly, that we get any riddles at all. That would have been a really easy thing to cut, to turn into an action sequence, to turn into an adventure sequence, to have Bilbo snatch the ring from Gollum and then escape through the tunnels and then pop out on the eastern side of the Misty Mountains just as the sun is setting on the west of the mountains. We could have done that very easily. We could have done that in the Jackson films too, and I know that there were people who were predicting exactly that in the advance of that first Jackson film. But I'm glad that this film exists and coming into it with such little respect. Here it is, mea culpa, right? I was completely wrong about this film. I thought this film was bad in a way that was amateurish, in a way that was embarrassing, in a way that was just like a cash grab, that was just people who didn't understand the text putting something together that doesn't really resemble The Hobbit at all, and that could not be further from the truth. This film is extremely flawed, mostly by Glenn Yarborough, Elizabeth, but it's also a film that is extremely quick on its feet and dedicated and making strong choices and celebrating those strong choices, right? Is it the best choice in the world to have Gandalf sidestep out of behind a tree to introduce himself to Bilbo and to do it with all of this? It's a very bold choice, but it is indicative of some real intelligence and some acuity working under the surface. This is never going to be my favorite adaptation of The Hobbit, but it is, I genuinely think, a necessary text. I have so completely come around on this now that I don't think that you ought to skip it. If you are listening to this after the fact, if you could not be here tonight with me for this live session here on Hobbit Day, and I know the Hobbit Day parties, we're all giving each other Hobbit Day gifts, the parades that are happening in every major city across this fair land, in every country on earth, in fact, I know that there's so much taking up our time on Hobbit Day, but if you are listening to this after the fact and you have not seen the 1977 animated adaptation of The Hobbit, then I actually genuinely urge you to do so, because it's kind of great. And no one is more surprised by my final thought on this than I am. I promise you. That, I think, is going to do it. Because it's Monday night, I have a harder out than I usually do. So I'm afraid we're going to... Chris says I talked him into it. He'll watch it again after 50 years. Chris, please do get in touch and let me know what you think. I would be so fascinated in hearing your thoughts after the fact, particularly after the context of this discussion. I think that would be so great. Quick bit of scheduling. Obviously, it is now Monday, the 22nd. We're not going to have a show tomorrow. This is our text episode for this week. I'll be back on Sunday with a whole new topic show, and then next Tuesday, which I don't have the date for, and no power on earth can summon such information forth in this benighted age. Next Tuesday, we're going to continue our look at The Hobbit. Excuse me. We're going to be looking at Barrels Out of Bond. We're going to be looking, in fact, at the Woodland Realm. We're going to be looking at Thranduil and really figuring out, wrestling with the idea, I think, in this kind of Silmarillion-ly inflected reading of The Hobbit, exactly how much Thingol is in Thranduil, exactly how much Menegroth is in the Woodland Realm, and how can we see these two civilizations as being in harmony with one another and as counterpoints with one another. I'm really interested in getting into that. It has turned into, weirdly, I didn't plan on talking about Lothlorien in the episode that I put out today, but it has been a very elf-heavy couple of weeks here, so I'm really looking forward to having those discussions and then seeing how we navigate it. Brian says, congratulations, you all nearly made it through Monday. Hey, y'all, if you are Patreon supporters, if you've pledged your financial support here to Next Word at patreon.com/nextword, then you can hang out, and in about 20 minutes or so, Elizabeth and I are going to be doing Made It Through Monday this week. No video for that show. It's just going to be a little audio conversation about what we've been doing this week and what we've been, thinking about and hanging out with. So if you want to be around for that, then by all means do. That is going to do it, though, for this Hobbit Day episode of Shire Reckoning. As always, thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you so much for making this possible. Thank you so much for joining me here tonight live. This has been so much fun. To Brian and to Chris and to Ryan and to Demon Dave and to Elizabeth and to Hugh. And is that everyone who dropped into the chat? I think it might be. I hope it is. If I've missed anyone out, then please know that you have my sincere thanks. And I hope that you'll join me again next week as we get into Barrels Out of Bond and our discussion of the woodland realm of Thranduil, the Elven King. That's going to do it for Shire Reckoning. I'll talk to you all again very soon. Until then, take care. Thank you all. Good night.